Greetings from Alaska. This is Fred Roll, Young Tribal Council member from Dillingham, Alaska. Um, I have an encounter that was shared with me from Johnathan. Johnathan's up from the Illiamna Lake area, which is north of Bristol Bay. Illiamna Lake is the largest lake in Alaska. Um, this happened back in, I believe he said it was 1982. Him and his brother James, went snow machining, still snow on the ground. It was midwinter caribou hunting, is how he put it. He didn't say whether it was December, January, or November, whatever. He just said midwinter hunt, which is typically in December-ish. So they left by snow machine, and they each had a new snow machine. They did well fishing that year. They went ripping back to do the caribou hunt. Well, it's quite a ways. You got to cut through this one valley, and then it cuts to another valley, and then you get out onto the open tundra from there to go after the porcupine herd. Well, porcupine herd is the name of the caribou herd. It wasn't literally a herd of porcupine. They don't roll like that up here. So anyway, they get out there. They're a good distance. They're in the last valley before they had to get to the edge of the tundra and go track them down, see where they're at. Well, as they're going through this valley, his brother's snow machine fails. Something with the particular model they had that year, there was a fuel issue, unbeknownst to them. So his brother's machine dies. So, okay, we'll just throw some of your stuff onto my sled that I'm towing, and then you ride with me, and we'll get this done. Starts up his snow machine. Within a mile, same issue happens. Identical fuel issue problems on both snow machines, so they're stuck. Of course, they had all their provisions. They weren't naked by any means. They had firearms. They had everything they needed, and plus they're First Nations. That's how they live. So they have to hike, and they have to hike all the way back to Non-Dalton, just outside of Non-Dalton. So they got a ways to go, but they know for a fact there's some trappers' cabins along the way that they can take refuge in when, the weather changes, too cold, nighttime. They didn't know how long it was going to take. What they were really hoping for was another villager or snow machiner just happenstance come by, and they can, get a ride out of there or warn someone that they needed help. They did have an old school handheld VHF, but the range, there wasn't much range. They only had that to communicate with another family member once they got up onto the tundra to find out where the herd was. But with the way the mountains are there, they had no way of getting a signal out with that small of an antenna. So they start hiking back on a pack trail, the snow machine trail, and the first cabin they come across is dilapidated. It's not worth the time to try to. They're better off sleeping underneath the tree, And so they're going along, and they're a few miles into it. Their snow machines broke down first part of the morning, so it's not even light this time of year yet. 5 a.m. in the wintertime in Alaska is like midnight anywhere else. It's still pitch black. It doesn't get lighter until closer to noon. Anyway, they're hiking along, and as they got their headlamps and things of this nature, but they felt no ominous threat or anything like that. They each had their caribou rifle. They weren't worried about bears. All the bears were hibernating. He said that as they were walking along, his brother James kept accusing him of throwing stuff at him because James was a few paces ahead of him, and James thought that Johnathan was periodically throwing little pieces of ice, snow, whatever. He wasn't. He said, "No, I'm not throwing anything at you." And as they're talking, discussing stuff being thrown, with their headlamps facing each other, they saw what appeared to be something 4 inches small drop between them, and they're looking down on the trail to see what the hell, and they hear movement off to their right hand side to the south of them. They heard movement at the base of one of the mountains where the tree line is in the valley that they were cutting through. Yeah, it was a very narrow valley up in there. So they're immediately that their whole aura changed. They're like something's going on here that we don't know the what's what about. They weren't immediately thinking hairy man, but they weren't ignorant to it either. Being First Nations, they were brought up with, I'm sure, the same stories I was about beware the hairy man and all that. They weren't putting two and two together. So they continue on down, and the second cabin they came up next to was in a lot better shape. This particular one had its roof, still had a stove, obviously, because there was an upside down coffee can on top of the wood stack. So they say, okay, we'll use this one if we have to, but we have all day to hike. Let's make tracks. Well, James, he didn't want to expend a lot of energy, and basically he was like, someone's eventually going to come by. I don't want to do all that walking. That's what it boils down to. I mean, in essence, anyway. So he puts up a fuss about wanting to continue, and Johnathan didn't want to continue alone. You know, you just don't want to separate yourselves when you're that deep in the bush, which, you know, I totally understand, and I wouldn't want to either. So I'm retelling this from what he told me. I have some notes written down, but I tried to talk to him about it several times, so I know how it went down. So I'm not sitting here, you know, reading from a book or something written down. So he agrees. Okay, fine. We'll just set up this little cabin, maybe start a fire, eat some lunch, you know, when that time rolls around. And by then we should hear somebody. Someone should either be looking for us or someone should be coming by. Because it was hunting season. Someone's bound to be by, and that's the main trail. So they're really not all that worried. It's starting to get light out now and all that stuff. And they weren't, you know, it was like no big deal kind of deal. So they get to the cabin, and it's unlocked, but all the windows are boarded up to keep bears out and whatnot. So they go in, check it out, make sure that nothing got in there and tore it up. And it was in, I mean, relatively good shape for what it was. It was just a shell with a wood stove and kind of a quasi broken down cot from what Johnathan said. And the windows were intact but covered. So there was just a single window on the back, he said, and a single one on the front. And this particular door, it was a relative of theirs that had built it a couple decades before and ended up passing away and wasn't able to really make a trapping cabin of it. But it was all, at the time he passed, provisioned out and real nice, but, you know, over a couple of decades of sitting there and really no one using it out of respect for the family and whatnot, it was relatively untouched. So the wood stove worked great. You know, there was a couple of rusted holes in the pipe, he said, but he made James, since James wanted to stay, climb up on the roof to take the coffee can off the top of the stack. And so he was like, yeah, no problem, you know, I'll do that part. And there was the upper portion of the stack with the china cap on it that he took with him. It's just a top 2-foot section of stovepipe with a china cap. So he goes up, he climbs up on there, and he removes the coffee can, and he's getting the china cap to, you know, shovel down on there. And I laugh because I've been in his position to get screamed at out of the blue. Well, he gets screamed at, and whatever screams at him it sounded like it was directly behind him. And it's just getting daylight. This is, you know, it really freaked him out. So he runs over the roof and jumps off in front of the door, turns around and runs in the door and slams it and puts a little brace in front of the door. And Johnathan heard the scream. Johnathan already had a gun in his hand. He was like, what the hell is going on there? Now, the windows are boarded up, so it's pitch black in there outside of their headlamps and the wood stove they just lit. So they're sitting in the dark, and it's not much brighter outside in wintertime Alaska. So they're really on edge because this scream was very close. And Johnathan was going to the back window to see there's some spacing in between the slats used to kind of board up the windows there. So he said as he was peeking through, all he could see was a little sliver, and he could make out trees standing, and every once in a while he would see movement, but he couldn't, because of the window pane and the difference between that and the covering the glass, he couldn't get close enough to the little slit to see through it, outside of just little bits of movement here and there. So they're super on edge. James is saying, "Hey, I think it's outside the front door." And Johnathan's like, "Calm down, it just screamed at you. You're overly, you're worked up, you're getting a little emotional, just settle down." Well, James wasn't having that. He goes, "Look, I'm a man. No one, you heard what I heard. That's a hairy man. We're something's not right." So they're discussing with each other, "Well, let's just walk out on the trail with our guns and shoot it if we have to, but let's not stay stuck in here. Who wants to be pinned? Because that's essentially what it was. They were pinned in this little place. Grant you, it's a cabin. It's it's somewhere to be outside of a barrier between the two. Anyway, so they're discussing amongst themselves for a while, and it gets deathly quiet, and way off in the distance they hear a snow machine, and they're like, "Yes, okay, someone's going to be coming. We'll listen." And they're right, maybe 20 yards off the main trail, their hunting trail, so they know whoever it is coming down that trail, that they feel very, very sure of. So being sure of themselves, they're waiting and listening, and it fades out. It's almost like it did a U-turn and left. And they're like, "Man, okay, well, there's hope. We heard one. It's still early in the day. Let's stay calm. Let's stay inside until we hear something get close." So they can't see out. The scream happened. They're not panic stricken, but they're very concerned. According to Johnathan, he said his hackles were up, but he wasn't scared. He was very hyper aware and ready to do whatever he had to do. And so they're waiting and waiting, and he wasn't sure how much time had passed. He said it had been at least an hour had passed, and they heard snow machine again. Same distance, same direction. This time it didn't fade back out. It kept getting louder and louder and louder. It's still at a distance, but they could tell it's closing the distance. So they get their stuff ready, and they're trying their best to kind of open the door and look at it and not overexpose themselves for something to snatch them. They do that a couple times. It looks good. He steps out, looks up on the roof above him. Nothing going on there. It basically quieted down. So they calm down. Okay, the hairy man heard the snow machine. It took off. It took off from there. So they hear the snow machine getting closer and closer. So they're like, "Hey, yeah, cool. Let's get our stuff, and we'll get on our trail to cut them off at the pass. Cut them off at the trail so they just don't pass us." And so they're scurrying to do that. And as they bust out the door and they're looking around, getting up to the main trail so they're not overlooked, they heard a scream coming from the direction the snow machine was. The hairy man screamed at the snow machiner. Now they were immediately petrified because of the loudness of the scream, and they're trying to stumble and make it to the trail. Meanwhile, this guy who was gingerly going along on his snow machine is now wide open, white knuckle, flying past them. They didn't even get all the way to the. Just how it played out it would just be so horrible. I feel for those guys, man. It must have been just made their heart sink. So it goes by, and it's loud. Those old, even the new sleds, they're very loud. So the guy, whoever it was, they didn't think hurt him, and they definitely didn't think he saw them, so they scrambled back inside because this thing was just right over there screaming at the snow machiner. So they ducked back inside and they slammed the door, and they're like, "Crap, well, maybe they'll, he was going away from from town. Maybe, you know, he's got to come back this way to get back to town. There was another trail, but it's further north and way out of the way. So they're banking on this guy making it back past there where he was just screamed at going through on a snow machine. I could only imagine just how. Anyway, I digress. So they're tucked away. It's quiet. They're eating some of their provisions, and they're trying to figure out, you know, WTF, you know. And he said at least 2 hours had passed, and it was probably as bright as it'd be for the day. So that would roughly be between noon and 2 at that time of year, roughly at that, you know, going up north or whatever. So they're anticipating this is the brightest part of the day. Maybe we should hike as fast as we can back towards town and make tracks while it's still daylight. They knew of other cabins. They were about 5-6 miles away, though, from the next protective shelter. And so they were leery about getting a jump on it. And so as they're discussing this, they hear the snow machine. They hear multiple snow machines. And they're like, oh, yes. So they kill that plan. Now they're anticipating the snow machiners getting closer and then getting out onto the trail. They want to minimize their exposure. You know, it screamed at them. Didn't outside of the screaming, it wasn't like it was, you know, trying to get them, but it was actively being, you know, I would consider that aggressive. Someone screaming at me and making it very clear I'm unwelcome. So, you know, it's all in perspective, I guess. So as the snow machiners are getting closer, their anxiety was building because they didn't want the same thing to happen. So they figured they're going to get out there a little sooner this time and be ready to, you know, defend themselves if they have to. And if not, just, you know, they come, they jump on the snow machines, they get the hell out of Dodge. So just as they're about to go out the door, here, you know, they hear the snow machines getting closer and closer. So they're, you know, they're more and more excited. And so they head out the door. They're like, now is the time to go. Let's just roll out. So they trudge through their little trail and they get onto the main trail. Now, this whole time that they got tunnel vision on trying to see the snow machiners through a little bit of the tree line, and as they're running up to the main trail. Now, once they got about halfway, and it's only about 25 yards roughly to the main trail. So, you know, they're a good 10, 12, 15 yards into this little jaunt to get to the trail, and they hear ka-thump, something land behind them. They immediately stop and turn around, and this thing appeared to have just jumped off the roof and landed behind them about half the distance from where they were to the cabin door. So now they're cut off from the cabin because of this hairy man. Immediately, they turn. They got their rifles up, you know, and they're backing up. They don't want to shoot. They want to get to the snow machiners that are coming. Now, the snow machiners are making progress as all this is going on, and so they're kind of trotting backwards and saying, "You stay there. You know, we're gonna shoot you. You stay there." And they're speaking in Yupik. You know, I can't. I'm not fluent enough. But so they're speaking this thing in Yupik, telling it, you know, you're not allowed to touch us. Just whatever they had to say. And they get to the main trail and they hear the snow machiners coming, but they're slowing down way before, like a good 50 yards away, just around this little bend, according to what Johnathan said, just out of view. So, you know, they're doing their thing and kind of sidestepping down the path to get into view of the snow machiners. They want them to know that they're there one way or another, you know, even if it's to witness this thing attack them, just so someone knows, you know. And so he said as they were side shuffling, kind of doing this weird, you know, kind of shuffle to make it down trail, because snow machine trail is very narrow, and if you step off that, then you're, you know, chest deep in snow. So you stay on the packed trail. So they're doing their little sidestepping thing, and he said one of the lead snow machines was just off the trail and had It wasn't like today. They're a 1 inch track back then was whoa. Most were half-inch little nubs, on a track. You barely got traction. So when it went off the trail, it was stuck, and it was going to take some manhandling to get it up onto the pack trail. So they're doing the side shuffle, and meanwhile, this thing it had turned and then ran to the back side of the cabin once they started sidestepping and getting past there. So from what he was saying is, I'm trying to envision this in my mind. Um, where they were, it was like a little bit of a SE kind of curve, but it was open enough to where you could see where the people were, and they weren't that far, but it was just a little bit of a little wiggle in the trail, so to speak. So he said once they got to that little wiggle, they had lost sight of it because it, for one, went behind the cabin, and for two, there was more trees between them and that cabin. So they get over to the people and they're like, holy crap, there's a hairy man over there. We were stuck in the cabin. And the one guy that was off the trail was like, yeah, I got these guys to come help. And thankfully, it was two neighbors and another relative of Johnathan and James. So they were very familiar with each other, and they knew no one was making up anything. They knew each other. So I'm only laughing because I can put myself in their shoes. I really can. So they're trying to get this snow machine unstuck because they're going to need it to get all of them out of there. There's 3 snow machines. They weren't made for 2-up riding back then, really. But they were going to make it happen. So one of them dumps his sled to have less weight on his snow machine, and they push the sled off the trail and then pull the snow machine back up on. And as they get the lead snow machine that was kind of blocking the trail back on the trail, this thing screams from behind the cabin, and they hear it banging against this cabin. Boom, boom, and it's echoing through the small valley. I mean, he said from one side to the other, it was echoing just kaboom, kaboom, just repetitively. So it was very ominous. They were very anxious, let's say. I don't want to say they were scared shitless, but let's just say they knew something bad was right over there. So they get it on there, they get it fired up, and now they're like, well, be ready to potentially shoot at this thing as we go by. We don't know what it's going to do. And as they're getting their little game plan, because they don't want to have to go off track again, get stuck in deep snow right next to a hairy man throwing stuff at them. Fair enough, So they start going, and 2-up riding on these little weak snow machines. I think they're like 340 cc back then, something weak, not made torquey and for packing a bunch of weight. But anyway, so they get moving, and as they're coming around the one corner, it's just basically a slight bend. It's not really like a 90-degree corner, but it's a slight bend, and the cabin comes into view a little better. They see it standing on top of that cabin. It's got that China cat piece of stuff he had just put on there in his hand, and it's just standing there, just kind of doing the swaying thing, holding it, kind of. He said he saw something similar with a chimpanzee holding a banana in the zoo, doing a little weird back and forth, but it was almost like, nah, see, you can't put it on there kind of thing. That's what he took from it. It would have been a really weird sight seeing the hairy man standing there just swaying back and forth, jiggling this thing. So they got by without incidents. It screamed once they were out of sight of it. It screamed. They could hear the scream over the brrr of the snow machine, and they just used that as motivation to not stop. Now, that's relatively mild. It could have been a lot worse for those 2 guys, man. Johnathan, I shared it as you told it to me. If there's anything I missed, just hit me back. You got my number, and I'll clarify it on the next video. For those who joined, thank you very much for participating and listening. Again, I'm Fred Roll, Curry tribal member from Illiamna, Alaska. I'd like to thank Rachel for her support in the channel. I want to thank Miguel, Sasquatch Sasquatch Theory. Sorry, Miguel. I was just on a Skype with them. Jeez. Anyway, Sasquatch Theory. D.A. Roberts, big supporter. He does anything and everything he can to help, and everyone else that's participating in this. Documentary's filming soon. I've already got the First Nations elders lined up for their interviews for this documentary. It's Alaska based. It's Alaska Native perspective on the hairy man, and it's going to be all First Nations experiences, encounters, and some historical things as we go through the documentary. But again, thank you to those, and till the next one.